folks, Scott here with a bit of a mid-month surprise for you. We have the Gina K Designs exclusive card kit. I do follow Gina K on YouTube, and I happened to catch her May 2025 release party, and I couldn't resist this versatile kit. Comes in this lovely box, and let's see what's inside. So of course we get a great index card showing everything that comes in the kit, the Floral Fix card kit, and that starts out with the Ruffled Blooms 6x8-inch stamp set and die set. Now these come to us bundled together, stamp and die bundle. So we've got the 6x8-inch stamp set, this lovely large Ruffled Blooms stamp with all sorts of sentiments and building sentiments. Thinking of you, sending smiles across the miles, sending a long distance hug. You're on my mind, you make my world a better place. Friend, hello, thinking of you and praying for peace. Great sentiments on this. And of course we get matching dies. Now one thing I didn't know, since this is my first Gina K Designs card kit, was that Gina includes magnetic sheets with her die sets. Oh my goodness. All your dies will come in a zip top bag like this, but a Gina K Designs magnetic sheet is included with all of the dies. That'll cut out, of course, the large stamp and all of the sentiments. And then we have the Mr. Fix-It 4x6-inch stamp set and die set as well. Now this stamp set has these great tools, a hammer, a wrench, pliers, a screwdriver. We've got a bolt and a screw and a nail, all sorts of buildable sentiments. When it comes to being a great husband, you nailed it. Grandpa, brother, dad, father-in-law, uncle, babe. Being with you fixes everything. That's fun. Of course, there's a Happy Father's Day here. Happy birthday, a Mr. Fix-It, which is the name of this stamp set. And of course, we have the matching dies as well. That cuts out all of the fasteners and the tools and all of the sentiments. And of course, Gina gives us a magnetic sheet to attach all of our dies to. I just love that. I just think that's such a great touch. If that weren't enough, we also get the Ruffled Blooms 5-piece coloring stencils. Now, Gina mentioned that these stencils were not actually quite perfect as she would like, but they certainly work. There's 5 of them. The big colors, the big blooms, then we've got 2 sets of petals on those blooms, and we also have the centers with the stems and the leaves with the absolute center. 5-piece coloring stencils that do go along with our stamp. Of course, you can use the stencils all on their own, or you can use them to color the Ruffled Blooms stamp. You just might have to be a little careful and shift things around as you are stenciling. And then another art stencil, we get a frangipani layering stencil. You can see the 2 layers to that. We've got the center, and then we've got the larger petals, a frangipani. Frangipani. Another layering stencil, 2-piece layering stencil, and then we get a free gift, a 3D embossing folder that actually matches the Ruffled Blooms stamp. Look at that, exactly the same. A lovely 3D embossing, and we also get an extra die with this. That die I threw in here already. Yep, here it is. This extra die will die cut this large bloom on the left here. Let me line her up. There we go. The large bloom right there. This die will cut that. That die actually comes along with your embossing folder. Now, though I've followed Gina for many, many years, does anybody remember Stamp TV? I've never bought one of her card kits. To be honest, I always thought they were a little bit expensive, but at $59.95, this kit is a nickel cheaper than what Hero Arts is charging for their card kits, and you don't have to subscribe. You just have to be quick. This kit sold out very quickly. Now, I do believe it was the Mr. Fix-It stamps and dies that originally caught my eye, and then when I saw the stencils and the dies and the embossing folder that worked with the ruffled bloom stamps, well, that clinched the deal for me. I'm very impressed with the amount of goodies in this kit, and doubly excited when I realized that Gina includes magnetic sheets with her die sets. That's a big plus in my book. And here we have our 10 cards using this kit. We have one large 5x7 card. Everything else is an A2 size. Everything is on a white card base. Now, my next door neighbor needed a wedding card right away. She was very specific in that she wanted a 5x7 card with yellow and pink flowers, and it had to say the most wonderful wedding in the world. Now, this ruffled blooms design is large enough to command a big card and still leave a little room for this rather unorthodox greeting. And we have the most wonderful wedding in the world. Now, I used the ruffled blooms coloring stencils on some Nina 80-pound solar white cardstock. I used that with the Hero Arts Lemon Drop and Creamsicle, Taffy Fruit Punch, Key Lime Fizz, and Green Apple reactive inks. Now, the stencils lined up very nicely amongst themselves, and I really like that the little 5-petaled centers were able to be colored separately. I did use my Silhouette software and the Dream State font to print the sentiment directly on the stenciled panel. Now, I did want to use the embossing folder on this, but since I was making a 5x7-inch card, it wouldn't fit in the embossing folder. So I opened up the embossing folder and lined up the stenciled panel on the flat folder. And of course, I taped it into place. Then I used a rubber embossing pad and embossing plate. I sent that through my die cutting machine, and I actually got a decent embossing that really makes those colored stencils really stand out. Now, this isn't intensely embossed, but it is lightly embossed, just enough to add that little detail to our flowers and leaves. I trimmed that panel to 4 1/4 by 6 1/4. I ink blended more lemon drop around the edges, and I added a mat of champagne metallic cardstock to the back before gluing it all down to a 5x7-inch card base. Some bright yellow gems adds the required wedding sparkle, and I'm happy to report that my neighbor was thrilled with this card. Now, since Gina mentioned that the stencils might need to be adjusted a little bit when working with the stamp, I decided that I would just color this stamp for my first go round with it, and we have a You Are On My Mind card. I stamped the flowers using Gina K Designs amalgam ink on 80-pound Nina Solar White cardstock, and I only used 8 colors to color all of these. Let me take a quick look here. I think I had these colors listed on my blog if you want to know. 5 yellows and oranges and 3 greens. Now, I don't care what ink you use to stamp your images, but I do find that you have to be careful when coloring with yellow alcohol markers. Invariably, lighter markers can pick up most any kind of stamping ink. Now, I always heat set whatever ink I'm using when I use my alcohol markers, but I still find that I need to be careful with light markers. I trimmed the colored panel to 4 1/8 inches by 5 3/8 inches, and I ink blended a little bit of green apple ink on the edges, and I embossed it with the embossing folder. I also remember to tape my panel down to an embossing folder, especially a 3D embossing folder, to help prevent shifting when it goes through your die cutting machine. This embossing came out really great. It really just highlights that stamp beautifully. I cut a panel of green cardstock to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 and glued that to the front of an A2 white card base, and I added the colored embossed panel on top, leaving a thin green frame exposed. Now, I stamped the sentiment with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, and I embossed it with clear embossing powder, and I die cut it with the matching die. I die cut 2 more sentiment blanks and glued all 3 together for a little bit of dimension, and then glued that to the card front. I like the little orange centers of the flowers, those 5 petals in the center, and the texture of the embossing folder. Wow, that's really, really nice. You are on my mind. Now, I'm loving that 3D embossing folder a lot. So I thought I could do a card featuring just the embossing folder. So we have You Make My World a Better Place. Now, I took a piece of Tim Holtz Craft Core cardstock in dark red. There it is, dark red right there. And this is that coordination stuff that you can sand the color off the top and expose craft cardstock behind. Now, I did a reverse embossing on that paper with the embossing folder. The flowers are debossed from the front, which effectively makes the background the highest part of the image. You can see here, this is opposite of what our actual stamp is. So that's a reverse debossing with that 3D embossing folder. I took Coordinations sanding block and set to sanding off the top of this card. With some careful sanding, I was able to reveal most of the embossed details on the flowers and leaves. I trimmed the panel to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8, and I tore about a 1/4 inch off the right edge before gluing the panel to an A2 white card base. I stamped the sentiment on a matching piece of cardstock using Hero Art's Unicorn white ink, and I embossed that with white embossing powder. I die cut the sentiment. Boy, I tell you, I love those detailed dies. Look, it even cuts out between those 2 lines. I used foam tape to pop it up a bit on the card front. Again, there's great texture on this card. I love that the flowers really stand out. They're kind of the darkest on here since they're debossed. The sanding went over the top of everything, but kind of missed the petals themselves. And the front of this card is actually, after sanding, it's oh so velvety soft, so simple, and yet so effective. You make my world a better place. Now, just because there are 5 stencils in the Ruffled Blooms coloring stencils doesn't mean that you have to use all 5 of them. And so we have our Thinking of You card with some simple stencil coloring here. Now, I stamped the flowers using VersaFine Onyx Black ink on 80-pound Neenah Solar White cardstock, and I used the Open Flowers stencil and Hero Art Splash Reactive ink to lightly color the 4 blooms. Now, I did have to shift the stencil just a little bit from flower to flower to cover everything nicely, but it was quite easy to line the blooms up. Now, I skipped the 2 petal stencils, and I used the inner petal stencil to blend Blue Hawaii Reactive ink in the center petals and Green Apple Reactive ink on the stems. I used the final leaf stencil and Green Apple ink for the leaves, and a tiny touch of Bundled Sage Distress Oxide ink for the flower centers. Even with having to watch where your stencil is, this stencil coloring was quite easy. Now, I die cut the flowers with the included die. Again, a nicely detailed die and easy to line up with the stamping. I took an A2 panel of white cardstock and I die cut that with an Altenew cross-stitch canvas die for a little bit of an interesting texture on the background without having to add any new colors. I glued that to an A2 white card base. I added the flower die cut using foam tape. I stamped, embossed, and die cut the sentiment as usual, added only 1 die cut blank to the back, and glued those to the card front. Some matching blue gems adds a great sparkle, and I think this simple coloring is really effective. Thinking of you. So our free embossing folder came with a die too. That die will cut out the largest, the middle left ruffled bloom stamp, or stencil. This is my sending love card. I used the 3 flower petal stencils on some Nina Solar White cardstock to color these blooms with tattered rose, worn lipstick, picked raspberry, and candied apple Distress Oxide ink. I did finish off the coloring with some squeezed lemonade Distress Oxide ink for the centers. Now, I die cut all 3 blooms with the included free die, and once cut, these blooms snap into place over the corresponding bloom on the embossing folder. I taped the blooms into place and embossed all 3. That works really well. Look at all the detail on those blooms that the embossing folder gives them. I ink blended some green apple reactive ink through this is through an old Stampendous Petals background stencil. Works just as well for leaves. And I die cut that panel to 3 3/4 by 5 inches with a Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die, and I added a thin black mat behind. I trimmed the slightest little bit from an A2 panel of pink cardstock and glued that onto a white card base, leaving the thinnest of white frames around the edge. I glued the matted background onto the pink and decided on my arrangement of blooms before stamping the sentiment with Versamark ink and embossing it with clear embossing powder. I did cut off the "and" at the beginning of this sentiment, which makes it more usable all on its own. This sentiment actually says "and sending love." I just got rid of the "and." And you can always stick that "and" back on and stamp the sentiment as originally intended. I mounted the blooms with foam tape. I added small black gems for sparkle. I also added some tiny black dots in the centers of the blooms. It's those little details and the impressive embossing that makes this card stand out. Sending love. So let's move on to the Mr. Fix-It stamps and dies. These tool stamps are what caught my eye in the first place. Now, I did stamp all the tools and fasteners using VersaFine Onyx Black ink on some Bristol Smooth cardstock and used my Zig Clean color markers to color everything. I did that twice, so I had 8 tools and 6 fasteners or something like that. Then I die cut all the pieces with their matching dies and set about making some truly masculine cards. And we have a Being With You Fixes Everything. Isn't that great? Now, I have some 2-inch aluminum foil duct tape in my stash. So I taped a piece of that on a scrap of white cardstock, and I embossed it with an old Sizzix Tim Holtz. This is a Distress Diamond Plate embossing folder. There are a few diamond plate embossing folders out there. I cut the embossed tape down to just a little under 2 inches wide by 5.5 inches tall, and I glued it to a white card base. I stamped and embossed the sentiment, as usual, directly on the card front, and I added a couple of silver mylar peel-offs from Love to Lizzie down the sides of the tape. I mounted the hammer and nail pointing directly at the sentiment with foam tape. This card, I love this sentiment. I love this card. This also reminds me of that old Abraham Maslow quote, "To a man with a hammer, everything is a nail." I've always loved using aluminum duct tape with embossing folders, especially this embossing folder. Being With You Fixes Everything. Yes, it was Father's Day recently. I felt obliged to make a card celebrating that one guy who keeps everything working. And we have our Mr. Fix-It Happy Father's Day card. Now, I know my dad was the go-to guy whenever anything broke or stopped working at home. He was the first to dig in and look at the problem, and was often all that was needed to get whatever it was repaired. He was a real Mr. Fix-It. Now, this card is almost all about the background. I took an A2 panel of some old, this is Alta New white wood grain cardstock. I don't think they even sell this anymore. I have a good amount of it in my stash. I took a panel of that and scored panels on the back every 3/4 inches from top to bottom. Then I die cut the panel to 3 3/4 by 5 inches with a Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die, and then I ink blended with a foam pad frayed burlap distress oxide ink around the whole panel. That makes the wood grain and scored planks really stand out. I added a thin black mat behind the wood grain and glued those to an A2 white card base. I stamped the sentiments with frayed burlap ink and embossed them with clear embossing powder, and I die cut them with their matching dies. I added the sentiments and the tools with foam tape. Oh, I do really love these tool stamps. Easy to color, great detail. This is even a great card for your personal handyman or mechanic or plumber, anybody you know that helps you out, regardless of whether they're your father or not. Happy Father's Day. Now I've got 4 more tools colored and cut and ready to use, and another great sentiment in this stamp set. And we've built a great life together. Now, I knew I had some measuring stick pattern papers in my stash somewhere. This is from an old Tim Holtz Ideology 8x8-inch collage mini stash pad. There's those rulers right down there. I die cut the pattern paper to 4.5 by 3 1/4 with a Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die, and I cut the center rectangle at the same time using the next smaller die, 4 inches by 2 3/4 inches. A thin white mat behind the centerpiece and a thin black mat around the larger piece allows you to glue them all together, and then down to a textured white card base. This has those little textured stripes in it. It's very subtle, but I think it adds a lot to this card. I stamped, embossed, and die cut and stacked the sentiment as usual, and glued that directly to the card front, and added all the tools with foam tape. I did take one of the die cut screws and the second nail and glued those to opposite corners of the inside writing surface. Here you can see that textured striped pattern a little bit better. This card would be great for an anniversary or a new home or any most familial celebration. We've built a great life together. Now I have one more big item left to use in this card kit, the Frangipani layering stencil. Only 2 layers, but it's a quite large image. And we have a hello card. That I did have to look up what a frangipani looks like. And this is my interpretation of the most common frangipani colors I found. On an A2 panel of Neenah Solar White cardstock, I ink blended worn lipstick distress oxide ink through the large number 1 stencil, trying to concentrate on the edges of the petals, and then I ink blended squeezed lemonade through the smaller number 2 stencil, trying to concentrate more on the centers. Now, I thought that worked really nicely and gave us a pretty good representation of a common frangipani flower. Since the stencils are a little larger than an A2 panel, I decided to fussy cut the whole image out. Quite easy to fussy cut this simple image. Now, I die cut a panel of dark green cardstock with a 3 3/4 by 5-inch Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die, and I glued that to a white A2 card base. Now I outlined that with some brushed gold Love from Lizzie peel-offs and mitered all the corners. You can see the mitering on the corners up there. I glued the frangipani on top, matching up the edges to the card base. I stamped the sentiment with VersaFine Onyx Black ink and then embossed that with gold embossing powder. I thought it brought that gold embossing powder more into the realm of the brushed gold on the edges. I die cut the sentiment and 2 blanks and glued them together before gluing them to the card front. Some brushed gold enamel dots adds a little more shine, and this card reminds me of spring. even as the summer starts bearing down on us. I think we hit 100 degrees in New York this coming week. Hello? Hello! There are, of course, more colors to frangipani than just pink and yellow. I did find a picture of one that was deep purple and red. And that gives us a sending you a long-distance hug card. I thought I'd try doing this stencil in reverse order. First, I did the Candied Apple Distress Oxide ink through the smaller number 2 stencil, and then I used Wilted Violet Distress Oxide ink through the large number 1 stencil. So the violet toned down the red, and together they make for some very vibrant blooms. I smushed a little of the inks on a craft mat, added a drop of water to each, and spattered the same 2 colors on the rest of the inked panel. When that was dry, I die cut the panel to 3 3/4 by 5 inches with a Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die. You know, Gina K loves her little black mats, and I certainly have to agree with her on that. I love my little black mats too. I added a thin black mat behind the die cut panel, and then a thin purple mat behind that, and I glued all the layers to a white card base. I stamped, embossed, die cut, and stacked just 2 layers of both sentiments as usual, and I glued them directly to the front of the card. I do really like the different sizes of sentiments in this kit, and I really like how detailed the dies for the sentiments are. And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, everybody deserves a hug every day. Sending you a long-distance hug right now. So that's my 10 cards using my first ever card kit from Gina K Designs, the Floral Fix card kit. I am pleasantly surprised by how many options are afforded with this kit. There's so much you can do with these supplies that I'm sure I've only just scratched the surface. I am going to have to keep a closer eye on the Gina K Design releases now. This is a great variety of cards, all from this one card kit. Those ruffled bloom stamps and all their matching supplies are oh so very versatile. The Mr. Fix-It stamps and dies are perfect for masculine cards of many varieties, and even the simple frangipani stencils can be used in many ways. Of course, this kit sold out so very quickly, but I do know that Gina K Designs will often reorder card kits if there is a big enough demand. So if you look and the current kit is sold out, do put your name on the Notify Me When Back in Stock tab so they have a good idea of how many to reorder. Now, I do know the Relax and Have Fun card kit from the June release is still available and actually has sentiments that coordinate with the sentiments in this kit. Now, hopefully, I can come back with more Gina K Design inspirations to share. I will keep my eye on her offerings. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me here. Your attention and encouragement keeps me inspired. If you like this post, please give me a big thumbs up. That really helps the YouTube algorithm. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please join us. Please subscribe. Click that little bell icon so you're notified when I put out a new video. Please take a few moments to like me, list me, pin me, post me, share me with all of your crafty friends. And remember, don't run with scissors. As always, I send you and yours love and light and happy crafting. For more detailed inspiration, better pictures, and product links, please visit my website at cardcutups.com.